Oh, Farrell's here. How nice. What a treat. What a treat to have Farrell Cotton with us. How's it, Farrell?
Hey, how's it, Rabbi?
Okay. Great. Okay, welcome back. We missed you.
Hey, miss you too.
So we're in the second paragraph of the Shema. Just by the heads up, I have to leave at 2:50 again, so it's going to be a very brief class today. I should be back to the half an hour on Tuesday. Okay, so we're in the Shema, and we've just been told the consequence of the mitzvot, the land of Israel, how it's, etc. And these words over here, and therefore impress these words upon your very heart. Bind them as a sign upon your hand, and let them serve as a symbol before you on your forehead. The tefillin that we learned on Tuesday. Now comes along. Where's my little thing here? Velimadatem otam et benechem. Teach them to your children. Ledaber bam, to speaking them, reciting them, meaning teach them to your children to the degree that they will speak about them when they are sitting at home, walking on the way, lie down and get up. So Rashi says here, where's our Rashi? Over here, let's just move our screen here. Ledaber bam, to speak of them. From the moment when your son, Rashi is speaking in the masculine, right? From the moment when your son knows how to speak, teach him the text Moses commanded us, the Torah, as a possession of the congregation of Jacob. That's a verse that in Hebrew says, Torah tziva lanu Moshe. A very nice kid's song about it. From the moment your children know how to speak, start teaching them Torah. So that this should be the means of learning, of teaching him to speak. In the Hebrew is much richer. Zeh limud diboro. How do people learn to speak? So, hi Adam. People learn to speak in the language and the concepts that they are exposed to. You pick up, it's funny when you see kids, right? They mimic their parents in the way that they speak. So says Rashi, the interpretation of this verse in the Torah, after we've heard about the importance of these matters, we are told, teach them to your children. Make these the words your children use. Let them, so that when they speak, it says the Ramban, right? To speak. Teach them to your children to speak about them when they're staying at home and on the way and lying down and getting up. So this is the vernacular. This is the speech that your children use. The Ramban, Nachmanides, says something very similar. He says, before, in the first paragraph, it says, Vishinantam levenecha, teach them to your children. And Rashi says, if they ask you a question, you should be able to answer immediately. Meaning you should have the Torah should be sharp, should be available for your children. Over here, the Torah, it's telling you something much more. It's telling you, no, make this the conversation, the words for your children. And I think, for me, this is, if we think about the implication of this, which I think is just, so important. What's the implication here? The implication is that, let's just finish the Rashi here. I'm sorry, I think I jumped. So the first thing you should teach your children is Torah tziva lanu, that Moses commanded us the Torah, so that this should be the means of teaching him to speak. from this, the rabbis derived the teaching. And this is, the rabbis did not mince their words. When the baby begins to speak, his father should speak to him in the holy tongue and should instruct him in the Torah. If he does not do this, it is as though he buries him. As it says here, and that's referring to over here. It's here it says, teach them to your children in order and put them on the mezuzah to the end that you and your children may endure in the land. So your long life in the land is dependent on what came before, says Rashi, right? Based on the Talmud here, the Midrash. That's the holy tongue, Lashon HaKodesh. That's teach them Hebrew and instruct them in Torah. And that I found a beautiful quote earlier. It's not we who shape words, but the words we use that shape us. We are, let's just take a step back and think about the implication of this. What is it saying? It's really saying it's vitally important that we teach our children Torah and the language of the Torah. It's called Lashon HaKodesh, the holy language. So the Rambam says, why is it called the holy language more than any other language? Well, the obvious answer would be because the holy books are written in it. It's the language of the holy books. But the Rambam says it's even essentially holy because there are no words in it for profanity. There are no swear words in Hebrew. In modern Hebrew, all the swear words are borrowed terms. If you think about swear words, most of them have to do with explicit sex and excruciation. That's what people, the S word, the F. What are they talking? Well, hang on a second. You're borrowing terms from sex and excretion to describe people and things, right? That's what we call in Hebrew nivel pair. That's disgusting speech. And the Hebrew is so pure, so holy, that it does not have any words for that. There are no words that uniquely identify those acts. They are all borrowed terms. So, whereas the act of sex in Lashon HaKodesh would be to know Adam knew his wife. Well, right? That's an intellectual term that's being used to, it's a borrowed term to be used for sex because there is no, right? Or he came upon, they're all borrowed terms. There are no explicit terms. So that's the holy language. That's who we are as a people. Meaning, our language is the lens, the tools through which we interpret, which we understand and interpret the world. Right? You can only describe something to the degree that you have the language to describe it. And knowing Hebrew and knowing the Torah and knowing the phraseology of the Torah is the Jewish way of understanding the world. We have this to some degree. We all have this to some degree. Nachas, right? Nachas. You should have nachas from the kinder. So that's, of course, it sounds Yiddish. It's a Hebrew phrase, nachat, right? But nachas, there's no English word for nachas. Joy. The joy from family, the joy that one gets from seeing one's children, one's relatives, one's friend, doing something good and being, who they're meant to be. It would take a book to describe what nachas is, but that's part of Jewish life. you know, when it's interesting, when Israel and the Zionist, the early Zionist thinkers, they really were, you know, many of them, I think unfortunately, thought about coming back to the land and establishing the land of Israel with a culture, with a Jewish culture that was not the Torah culture. So that was the debate. Which culture are we going to impose upon the land? And there was even, you know, the Yiddish culturalists. Yiddish culture. What's Yiddish culture? Yiddish is a language. Every culture has its language. And the culture, it says over here, is this is Jewish culture. If we don't teach our children Hebrew, if we don't teach them Torah, how are they going to pick up on Jewish culture? I remember once there's a Rabbi Levine. It's a very nice book called A Tzaddik in Our Time, A Righteous Person in Our Time. It's written about an amazing rabbi that lived in Jerusalem, probably in the early part of the last century, and well, maybe not so. I'm not sure when he passed away. Rav Aryeh
He
Levine.
died in the 60s. He died over Pesach in the 60s. I know this because I lived on the same little pedestrian-only street in Nachlaot, and there's a couple of plaques on his house.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. So thank you. So he died in the 60s, and he was a very saintly man. He was a great Talmid Chacham, but he took care of the prisoners, the Jewish, you know, in those times in the 60s. Or before, before 48, he was known as the rabbi for the prisoners, and he was a saintly man that took care of every person. And he has some children that live in America, and actually one of his grandsons lives in Philadelphia, and his daughter is a neighbor of mine. So you know, sometimes when he comes to visit his daughters in the shul, and I schmooze with him, and I asked Rabbi Levine, you know what, he used to go and visit his grandfather during the summer vacation. He used to go to Jerusalem to visit his grandfather. And I asked him once, what was it like? So he said, you know, they didn't have anything else. All they had was the Torah. Life was so simple. They had no materialism. And he said everything was Torah. You know, something would happen and they would mention a verse or a phrase from the Gemara, from the Talmud. They understood, interpreted, and related to the world through the language of the Torah and the Talmud. And I was just blown away. First of all, I was blown away that he recognized that. And he told me they spoke. I said, what language did they speak? He said, they spoke in Lashon HaKodesh. You know, like we pronounce our Hebrew with that Ashkenazi pronunciation in prayer, they would speak that way. Ashleimcha, etc. And he said it was amazing that their culture was a culture of Torah. So, you know, I actually just saw a beautiful, I was watching a video, interview with Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, he should be well. And he pointed out something very interesting. He said, there's no word in Hebrew for to obey. There's no word to obey in Hebrew. And when modern Hebrew was reconstructed, they had to borrow a word from Arabic. They borrowed a word from Letzayet right? That's not based on a Hebrew word. The only word for obey in Hebrew is Shema, Shema Yisrael. And we know that it doesn't mean obey. It means to listen, to hear, to understand, right? And Rabbi Sachs's point was, this is not a tyranny, right? We do not, God commands and we obey. That's not such a Jewish thought. No, God speaks. We understand, and then we partner with him in the creation. That's a very different dynamic, and that comes out of speaking, out of the way that we speak. So that's why, says Rashi, you know, if you don't give your children the vernacular, if you don't give your children the words of Torah, if you don't allow them to have the phraseology, to have the conceptual framework of Torah, it's very hard to be Jewish. You'll get the wrong ideas. You'll interpret it in the wrong way. This is a big challenge for all of us. Our mother tongue is English. Here we are having this conversation in English. It's very difficult. We are in that framework, whether we like it or not, thinking like Englishmen. Okay, there's one. I think another implication of this is for us is, when we think about the importance of teaching our children Torah, there is a tension because we live in modern liberal societies, and that is that religion has been relegated to the domain of the individual. It's an individual choice. What do you mean? As soon as I say, well, I got to educate my kids in Torah, I got to teach them the Torah, what word comes up in our mind? Indoctrination. We're going to indoctrinate them. But hang on a second. I teach my, no one accuses me of indoctrinating my children by teaching them mathematics and science and English and the livelihood. Well, why don't I stop and ask them their choice? And I think that the problem is exactly what I mentioned, that religion's been relegated to the domain of the individual, and therefore it's an individual choice, and therefore by me forcing it on my children, I'm really doing something wrong. That's a mistake. That's a big mistake. We don't think of Yiddishkeit, of Judaism, of what we're studying here as an individual choice, right? We think of this as we think of this as a social, national, global matter, right? My children are not, if this, I taught my children to recycle. That's something I think is a good idea. I agree with it. We should recycle. So some people don't believe in that, right? Some people are not. So hang on a second. Did I indoctrinate my children? No, this is a global matter. This is something which is relevant to the world. This also has, this all the more so that this has relevance to the world. So, we need to be careful with that tension, because not only we speak the language of English, of England, of America, of Western liberal society, we think in those terms. And sometimes they are very different and don't see the world, oftentimes, do not see the world in the way that the Torah sees the world. Moses says, this is your life, this is your destiny, this is not only your national, but this is the solution to global issues, this Torah. So, I'm not going to teach my children about that? Are you crazy? Of course I'm going to teach my children about it. Okay, folks, I better go pick up my child now that I've spoken about them so much. I need to run because I have to pick up Shlomo from school. Hope to see you on Tuesday. Have a beautiful Shabbos, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you. You too. Much love.